Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Adrian Zenz, njemački antropolog i vodeći svjetski stručnjak za pitanja Ujgura u Kini, glavna meta kineske propagande posljednjih godina zbog svog istraživanja uslova u kojima žive Ujguri, gost je emisije Recite Al Jazeeri. Dr. Adrian, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel, and thank you so much for taking time to speak to us. Now, there are so many things that I would like to talk to you about, but let me start by asking you, as one of the world's leading scholars on the Uyghurs in the Xinjiang region in China and China's harsh policies towards that region, could you share with our viewers the challenges you face on an almost daily basis working on documenting crimes committed against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, bearing in mind that you are based in the US and you're not allowed to travel to China, and I guess you rely a lot on personal interviews, right? And of course on satellite imagery from other organizations. You collaborate a lot with other human rights organizations in documenting these crimes committed against the Uyghurs.
Yes, thank you very much for having me and for covering this important topic. Indeed, in 2021, the government in Beijing officially blacklisted me and prevented me from going to China. Of course, it would have been far too dangerous before that. And in fact, even as early as 2013 and 14, researchers and anthropologists trying to research the Uyghur region were harassed. And then years later, some were even detained as they tried to do research. My research draws on a range of data sources that are usually linked to remote sensing and document analysis. We include witness accounts. On several occasions, we were given important sets of internal government documents. Internal documents very directly reflected the intent, the nature, the scale, and the policies driving the atrocities, the manifold atrocities. At the same time, I would emphasize that the most important approach for uncovering Beijing's actions against the Uyghurs has been an investigative form of policy analysis based largely on publicly available information by combining local propaganda accounts, giving evidence of actions on the ground with high-level policy documents, and then statistics, government yearbooks, and reports. Triangulating this data has actually been the most effective approach, really.
Now, in your research, you have highlighted how President Xi Jinping had a direct and still has a direct role in the systematic campaign of religious and cultural repression against Uyghurs. Now, how do you interpret the broader political and ideological motivations behind this top-down directive?
The broader motivation is regime security. The Chinese Communist Party knows what happens if you lose control, if somebody else comes into power and prosecutes you for your crimes and for what you have done. And regime security in the Uyghur region means absolute political control. Absolute political control requires absolute ideological control. That requires cultural assimilation, linguistic assimilation, control over religion, securing movement, complete surveillance, and as a result, Xinjiang has developed one of the world's most advanced police and surveillance states to control movement. And of course, the mass internment of potentially 1 to 2 million Uyghurs and other ethnic group members in re-education camps. That campaign was motivated by the attempt to transform their thinking, reorient their loyalty from their culture, from Islamic faith, away. We even have the mass sterilizing of Uyghur women, which really is an outrage, especially to anybody with sort of a religious affiliation, especially to Islamic countries. Mass sterilization to reduce Uyghur population growth. Again, it's a strategy of demographic control, of controlling the population, reducing their density.
Right. Why exactly is Xinjiang as a region important to Beijing? Is it only for trade with Central Asia, or are there other reasons as well?
Now, there are several reasons. Firstly, Xinjiang occupies nearly 1/6 of China's entire landmass.
Exactly.
It's the largest region. It borders 8 countries and is therefore geopolitically a core hub and strategic border region of the Belt and Road Initiative and of China's pivot towards Central Asia, outcompeting Russia for influence in Central Asia. We should also not forget the raw materials. Xinjiang has large reserves of natural resources. It produces also over 20% of the world's cotton, besides a large agricultural sector.
Now, I wanted to ask, from the leaked documents you have had access to, did the orders to incarcerate Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities come from top communist officials in Beijing, or was it local party officials hoping to satisfy their senior officials that had the autonomy to carry out mass internment, reeducation, so quote-unquote reeducation campaigns, and forced sterilization campaigns under the guise of combating extremism?
All the key orders came from Beijing. But what happened is that Beijing gave the local authorities to order to pivot toward re-education and political indoctrination. And to do that, the local authorities had the authority from Beijing to experiment, to try out different approaches at political indoctrination and re-education. This was closely observed by Beijing. And then at some point, likely in 2016, a decision was made to pursue mass re-education in centralized dedicated internment facilities. But the leaked documents clearly prove that the approval to then proceed with that approach came from Beijing and the financial support.
Now give us an insight into how do these re-education centers look like? And was the idea to eradicate any sense of cultural and religious belonging among Uyghurs, or was it to reinstate the communist ideology into their minds, or a combination of both?
It's a combination of removing cultural and religious beliefs. Uyghurs were forbidden from speaking their language, from praying prayers or expressing any religiosity in the camps. To the contrary, they had to renounce Islam. They had to renounce whatever they believed in, whatever belief it was. And instead, they had to sing praises and thank, like before meals. They had to give thanks to Xi Jinping. They had to praise the Communist Party. So it's an ideological replacement of religiosity with the ideology of communism.
And what was the Chinese government's attitude towards other non-Uyghur Muslims, such as Hui Muslims or Kazakh minorities in the same region?
It was very similar. These groups were also persecuted, not always at the same intensity, but similarly, any religiosity was attacked. In fact, there were some reports of Uyghurs who had converted to Christianity, or of Han Chinese, who were part of Christian Protestant churches, who were also put in camps, also had to renounce their religion, also were prosecuted. This, of course, flies in the face of the Chinese government's false claim that this is linked to Islamic terrorism or the religious extremism linked to Islam, given how they were persecuting other faiths as well, including Christianity.
Now, Dr. Adrian, could you provide insights into the role of that advanced surveillance technologies and artificial intelligence play in this systematic repression of Uyghurs? How do these things function on a day-to-day basis? I've come across some reports saying that every local citizen had to download a certain app where they could follow his or her movements around the country, around the region, see who he or she communicates with, and so on and so forth. What do you know about this?
It was a multi-pronged approach that relied on mass human resources, so a mass expansion of the local police and security apparatus. So you needed feet on the ground, eyes on the ground. You had an expansion of police stations, creating grids, and every grid had several blocks. And in every grid, you have a police presence and a surveillance presence. This was combined with a mass expansion of surveillance cameras. They could also record audio, did automatic transcription of Uyghur, for example, and other languages. And from that, you had a so-called big data predictive policing, where you get so much data that it's almost impossible to humanly analyze. So predictive policing uses AI algorithms to engage in facial recognition, but also to combine behavior patterns. For example, if somebody left their house through the back door rather than the front door, if somebody bought too much sugar or put too much gas in their car, if somebody went to various places or was difficult to track down, or associated with was in proximity with other persons, The predictive policing system connects the dots, analyzes the data through AI algorithms in order to create alleged threat profiles. These threat profiles would then trigger automated alarms at the police stations. And oftentimes these people were then identified for automatic interrogation or even internment.
There were reports of certain centuries-old mosques being demolished in the region. I wanted to ask you, what is the current state of Xinjiang's mosques? Are they open to public? Are they open for prayers? Can people go in freely and attend? Of course, not freely, but can at least the older population attend mosque congregational prayers?
Many mosques were demolished. A limited number of larger and very prominent mosques are open, predominantly for purposes of tourism, or to show it off, or to pretend that Islam is not banned in the region. What we see, however, from visitors is that these are heavily surveyed. There's security and fences, there's cameras everywhere. The only people who dare to pray are a limited number of mostly elderly people. The state is also slightly more tolerant of elderly people expressing religiosity, but anybody who's younger doesn't dare to go in because they fear being arrested.
How would you compare the current situation in Xinjiang to other contemporary cases of genocide or mass atrocity crimes committed in terms of methods, in terms of government objectives, and in terms of the international response?
We've had an independent tribunal chaired by Sir Geoffrey Nice, an international legal expert and prosecutor, determined that the actions there constitute crimes against humanity and genocide in the Uyghur region. The main reason for this was unconventional data points, not mass killing, but mass prevention of births, which is one of the 5 criteria in the 1948 UN Convention for the Prevention of Genocide. There are several: separating parents and children, mass murder, but one of them is mass sterilization, preventing births, which will affect the size of a population. And as a result, this is one of the main factors in terms of looking at a genocide determination. The determination of crimes against humanity has several other factors that are more similar to atrocities we see in other places. So, for example, there's a mass attack on a population through mass internment. We have seen that before in places. We have a mass separation of parents and children leading to cultural destruction of religious sites, the outlawing of religion. This is a mass attack on a group's culture and identity. These are more common. I think so the most kind of standout aspect of the atrocity, it's maybe the intensity of the mass internments and the size and the scale in terms of the percentage of the targeted Uyghur population, but it's also in particular the prevention of births by sterilizing Uyghur women, forced insertion of intrauterine devices which prevents them from becoming pregnant.
I remember back in 2000 when I was living in Kuala Lumpur, the then target of the Chinese government was the Falun Gong religious group, but this doesn't seem to be anywhere close to the Chinese government's back then reaction towards Falun Gong.
I see a somewhat similar blueprint because the Chinese government did 2 things with the Falun Gong. Firstly, it developed a more brutal and ruthless indoctrination or brainwashing approach that tried to really break through psychological barriers, because Falun Gong are very dedicated believers in their spirituality. And this approach was also is being used against the Uyghurs, who are also quite devoted devotees of their faith. So it's particularly designed to break religious devotion. Secondly, I see that the government established a re-education approach against the Falun Gong, aiming at a certain scale, meaning trying to re-educate a substantial percentage of Falun Gong practitioners who were considered active. And we similarly see that the state has been incarcerating a fairly significant percentage of the Uyghur population for re-education and internment to eradicate faith and culture. So I see those 2 similarities.
Now, in relation to this, I want to ask you if you could discuss the psychological and cultural ramifications that this widespread internment and re-education policies have had on the Uyghur population, especially on their societal fabric and their societal structures?
We see a concerted attack that is breaking apart organic communities, also through forced labor transfers, shifting Uyghurs to work in Han Chinese factories and factory parks or other provinces. We see mass separation of parents and children through boarding schooling, full-time boarding schools, even full-time kindergartens, preschools. We see a mass change in Uyghur ability to practice their culture and religion. And we see mass changes in a very social structure. Even the way Uyghur homes are arranged, the traditional home, is being changed and is being more, their homes are being changed to be more like the homes of the Han Chinese.
China has recently been inviting food bloggers and influencers to visit Xinjiang and make video clips on Uyghur cuisine. I've watched quite a number of these video clips. Are these mostly Western influencers and video bloggers helping, in a way, whitewash the Communist Party's crimes?
The Chinese government has launched an all-out propaganda campaign, given the extent of the revelations of its atrocities. And this propaganda campaign relies on modern techniques such as using social media influencers, thinking that this is the way, since they cannot control the Western press or Western governments, they can at least try to influence society through these influencers. And so this is the latest tactic, and I think some of these influencers are willingly complicit, knowing exactly what they're doing. Others are maybe just more in between in a gray zone. They know something isn't quite right, but they're also very maybe ideologically, aligned or, in favor with the Chinese Communist Party or they're anti-United States and feel, okay, it's being exaggerated. Let me show the truth. And if you go there now, the police presence has been reduced. The camps have been shifted outside. Many of the camps closer to cities have been closed down. So it's become much less visible. And to somebody who's just a tourist, Xinjiang probably looks really beautiful because the government has poured billions into buildings, into industry, into infrastructure, high-speed trains, everything. So to an outside observer with a little background, they think, well, this is great. Poverty is being alleviated, but they don't look closely. And in that way, these people, they become complicit in excusing a mass atrocity.
And how do you make sense of the fact that you have certain leftist American websites such as the Gray Zone Project and journalists such as Max Blumenthal who have been in the past supporting Bashar al-Assad, who have supported Vladimir Putin and his invasion of Ukraine, who are now supporting the Chinese government and attacking independent researchers such as yourself?
Yeah, that's very interesting. Actually, some of these people might be dedicated left-wing. People like the Gray Zone is actually much more populist, meaning they go where the wind blows. So some of them have become right-wing now. Some of them have become right-wing. So it's they're not being ideologically consistent. But the most effective strategy of the Chinese Communist Party has indeed been to try to sway Western leftists, particularly intellectuals, even academics.
Right.
And that has been successful to a shocking extent, I would say. Thankfully, most of these are not policymakers. They cannot stop Western policymaking. They haven't infiltrated the media. But yes, this has been an interesting strategy. And the only way for the Chinese state to really attack me has been to attack my character and motivation, because my research is based on their own documents, on their own data, on their own policy. What is there to defend?
And in relation to this, how would you comment generally on the role mainstream international media have played in highlighting the internment and the destruction of the Uyghur way of life?
The mainstream media has done a good job in covering the atrocity, in doing in-depth reporting, including investigative reporting. We've had significant media work done. The main problem now is that the media is very vulnerable to China's strategy of controlling access to the region. The media always needs something new. The media is in many ways beholden to the attention span of its domestic audience, of its constituencies. That's a terrible problem. And the Chinese, of course, are making sure that there isn't much news coming out of the region, that there's not new witnesses, for example, that there's not evidence, and you can't really freely go and examine what's going on. Like another place, like in Gaza, you can see bombed out buildings. You have social media images. You have everything. Hong Kong, the riots in Hong Kong, everything was covered close up. But there's almost no media, very little media or evidence coming out of Xinjiang in the last couple of years. And that is the strategy of the CCP. And the Western media has proven well, what's the right word to use? They're affected by that. They're affected, and their reporting has decreased. And so the extent to which Western audiences are informed about this atrocity has declined, sadly.
Right. As we move towards the end of our interview, I wanted to ask you, Dr. Adrian, various Muslim-majority countries have taken different stances on the Uyghur issue. For instance, while Turkey has occasionally criticized China's treatment of Uyghurs, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan have voiced their support for Beijing, and they even signed a letter a few years ago expressing their full support for this quote-unquote anti-terrorist activities in the region. How do you interpret these divergent diplomatic positions, and what factors, I'm assuming it's trade and investments, but what other factors influence these countries' responses towards the plight of the Uyghurs?
Yeah, what you say is one of the saddest aspects of how the Uyghurs have been betrayed by many Muslim groups and countries, even Muslim associations like in Indonesia. One of the world's largest Muslim associations in Indonesia came out in support of Beijing's policies. And the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the OIC, has been invited many times and issued statements in favor of the CCP's policies targeting Uyghurs, which is really unbelievable. It's been largely Christian countries, well, culturally Christian countries, that have signed letters condemning the atrocities and speaking out vocally against the atrocity. And I believe, on the one hand, we have a strong economic and financial incentive that Beijing is investing significant amounts to silence critics and to buy elites. It's called elite capture. But on the other hand, Beijing also is an ally to countries who have a bad human rights record, like Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. They are being criticized by Western governments for atrocities. Beijing will not do that. So they are kind of hedging their bets. They want to kind of appease all sides. Even Turkey, Erdogan, has been very careful because he needs Beijing, because they will not abandon him if he oppresses his population or does anything. And a lot of these governments actually are not fond of Islam necessarily in their own countries, right? Islamic movements can ask for political independence or influence that some of these governments are not willing to grant, because some of them are not fully democratic. And so many of them, unfortunately, do not represent the interests of religious devotees.
Right. Well, you're absolutely right in the sense that it was mostly culturally Christian countries in the West, Western-based experts such as yourself, or Western-based international organizations such as Human Rights Watch and Amnesty and your own foundation, which have been drawing the world's attention towards the plight of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Dr. Adrian, it was a pleasure speaking to you. I'm afraid we'll have to end here. Thank you so much once again for speaking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Always trust.
We ask the question.
What is needed in the world?